I've loved stories for all of my life. I love to tell them. I love to listen to them. And as a physician, I have been put down because I am a storyteller. In my profession, stories are seen as anecdotal evidence, a kind of a second-rate truth, a truth that has very limited value compared to data and research. But stories have a lot more power than data. And I discovered this about 14 years ago when, quite by accident, I was given a book contract. And this was very confusing to me, very stressful, because I'm not a writer. And my publisher pointed this out to me. Almost the very first words out of her mouth were something like, remember, you're not a writer. Do you want someone else to write this book for you? And when I said, no, I'd like to try it myself, I could tell that this was not the answer she was hoping for. And then she said, well, remember, you're not a writer, so be sure just to write about what you know personally. And in the end, that's what I did. I did write about what I know, what I'd learned from the hundreds and hundreds of people with cancer that have been my patients in 42 years of being a physician, what I've learned from 55 years of living with an incurable disease called Crohn's disease and having had 8 major surgeries myself, what's been shared with me by people in grocery stores, on airplanes, in the ladies' room, And because I wasn't a writer, my stories, my memories were all that I had. And they're all that any of us have. And what I discovered from writing these books of stories is that they're all that any of us need. Because stories, they have the power to help us to live beyond our limitations, beyond even our beliefs about ourselves. And the best stories give us new eyes. They help us to see ourselves differently, to see life differently. They help us to become more without becoming different. They help us to find the deeper meaning and satisfaction in the lives that we are already leading. Stories are, at their deepest nature, about meaning. And meaning is a function of the heart and not of the intellect. I've come over time to see the heart not as a valentine, but as an organ of vision. A way of seeing that allows you to see below the surfaces, below the masks that everybody is wearing, and the masks that life wears, to what really is there. And when you hear a story reminds you to listen to life from the heart. It reminds you that even the smallest things that happen can have great meaning. And it enables you to open your heart enough to recognize this meaning and to fill yourself up. Meaning has the power to be a source of strength in difficult times. It strengthens us not by changing our lives, but by changing our experience of our lives. And that's what stories do. They change our experience of our lives. They remind us of who we are, what's important, what we might do, and what we might be. And a good story is like a compass. It points to something real, something that has remained real over time, something that can be trusted, something you can hang your life on. Lopez, in his wonderful children's book, which is called Crow and Weasel, says, sometimes people need a story more than food in order to live. And so the best stories are really about the art of living. And so tonight I wanted to talk a little about these stories, about the art of living, and to share some stories with you. You know, my own stories, other people's stories, in the hopes that they will help you to remember your stories, the ones that have helped you to live. They will help you perhaps reflect on your own direction, your own way of moving through the world. And so I'd like to start with a story about my mother, because it was my mother who called my attention to the art of living by the way in which she died. Mama was a remarkable lady. If she was alive today, she'd be 108 years old. And she was one of the pioneers of public health nursing in the United States. She had a career at a time when few women had careers, at a time when women who worked outside of the home were seen as morally suspect. And at one time, she actually directed the Department of Health for the city of New York. When she was 84 years old, she chose cardiac bypass surgery because it was her last chance to live, and the odds were very long. 4 chances in 10 that she would not survive this surgery. But my mother was not your ordinary elderly woman. She had lived her life as a maverick and as a risk taker, and to her the odds looked good. And so the morning of her surgery, I went to the hospital to discover that they'd moved the time of the surgery forward, and I was just in time to kiss her before they took her upstairs. And she had pulled me close and whispered in my ear, Rachel, there's something I want to tell you. I want to be sure that you know that no matter what happens here today, I am satisfied. And I hope you will do whatever you need to do to be satisfied as well. And then she smiled, her charming and rakish smile, and they took her away. And these were her final lucid words to me. I am satisfied. And I thought about them for a long time, wondering what they meant. You know, my mother had a successful career. She had many achievements. But I don't think it was this that gave her such a sense of peace and ease in the face of almost certain death. And over time, her words have turned into a kind of a question. How do I live so that at the end of my life, I too might say, I am satisfied? And you know, I have come to suspect that the key of this sort of satisfaction is not in the world of recognition or power or wealth or possessions, that this kind of peace and satisfaction at the end of a long life is about the art of living. It's more about that than how much we have accumulated or who knows our name or how much we know. So one of the things about the art of living, it's about receiving all of our blessings. Most of us have been given many more blessings than we have received. We don't take the time to receive our blessings. We're busy, we're distracted. We may not even recognize our blessings. But mostly, our beliefs about life and about ourselves prevent us from actually having the things that we've already been given. So I'd like to tell you a couple of stories about this. This is one of the first lessons on living well that my mother told me when I was a very small girl and she was a young woman. In the middle drawer of her dresser were silk stockings, many dozens pairs in beautiful colors, each wrapped in their original package from the store. They'd never been worn. I used to love to pull up a chair to the open drawer and touch them, counting the packages and admiring the beautiful colors. Once I asked my mother why she never wore them, and she told me they were too good to wear. If she wore them, they'd get torn or damaged, and they couldn't be replaced because it was wartime, and all the silk in the United States had been diverted into making parachutes. She was saving them, she said, for a special time. Each year in the summer, we would go away to a little rented cottage on Long Island to escape the hottest part of the summer in the city, leaving our apartment in Manhattan empty. And one year when we came home, we discovered that our apartment had been ransacked and burglarized. I remember walking through the rooms, shocked to find many of my family's prized things missing, and others broken and thrown all over the floor. But the most shocking thing was in the bedroom. My mother's dresser drawers hung open, and the middle one was completely empty. This was my first serious lesson about loss. At the time, I was always being scolded by my teachers for not taking better care of my things. But my mother had taken very good care of her stockings. She had never even used them. I puzzled over this for a very long time. Now, this is a happening that had a very profound effect on my family. My father put more locks on all of the doors. And every place we lived afterward had many locks on the windows and at least 3 locks on every outside door. But this didn't seem to answer my questions. Eventually, I began to use everything I owned. An elderly patient who had outlived his entire family once told me that all we get to keep are our memories. Perhaps the only way we get to keep anything is to use it up. You know, more than 55 years later, I think about those stockings with regret. There's an even more common way, a much more American way, that we don't receive our blessings. A long time ago, the little son of one of my friends and I became very good friends. And a lot of the time we played with his tiny little cars. They were called Hot Wheels, right? And he had 2 of them. And we would run them from windowsill to windowsill, parking them and racing them and telling each other all the while what we imagined that we were passing on the road. It was fun. And I loved this little boy dearly. And at that time, these little Hot Wheel cars were collected by most 6-year-old boys, and Kenny dreamed of them. And I yearned to buy him more, but I couldn't think of a way to do this without embarrassing my friends who had very little money. And then one of the major gas companies began a Hot Wheels giveaway, a car with every fill-up. And quickly, I persuaded the entire clinic staff at Stanford to buy this brand of gas. And for a month, I organized us all with checklists so that we wouldn't get 2 fire engines or 2 Porsches or 2 Volkswagens. And in a month, we accumulated all the Hot Wheels cars that were being made at that time. And I gave them to Kenny in a great big box. They filled every windowsill in the living room. And then he stopped playing with them. Puzzled, I asked him why he didn't like the cars anymore. He looked away, and in a quivery voice, he told me, "I don't know how to love so many cars, Rachel." You know, many of us have too many Hot Wheels to love. It can make you feel empty. A woman who found a new life after having cancer once told me that before she had gotten sick with cancer, she'd always felt empty. That's why I needed to have more and more things, she told me. I kept accumulating books and magazines and newspapers and clothes and people, which only made things worse, because the more I accumulated, the less I experienced. Have everything, experience nothing. You could have put that right on my front door. And all the time I thought I was empty because I didn't have enough. And the change in her life began with a bathrobe. It was one of the 3 pieces of clothing that she'd taken with her to the hospital for her cancer surgery. Every morning she'd put it on, really enjoying how soft it was, what a beautiful color it was, and the way it moved around her when she walked. And then she'd walk in the hall. One morning, as I was putting it on, I had an overwhelming sense of gratitude, she told me, just grateful to have it. And then she looked at me and seemed really embarrassed. She said, "You know, it sounds funny. I felt lucky. But the odd part, Rachel, was that it wasn't new. It was one of the 6 bathrobes that I have hanging in my closet. I'd never even seen it before." When she finished her chemotherapy, she had a garage sale and sold half of everything she owned. She laughs and says her friends thought she'd gone chemo crazy. But doing this has really enhanced her life. She says, "I have no idea what was in my closets or my drawers or on my bookshelves. I didn't know half the people whose home numbers were in my phone book either. Many of them never even sent me a card. I have fewer things now and I know fewer people, but I'm not empty." Having and experiencing are very different. Having was never having enough. We sat together in my office for a few moments, watching the sun make patterns on the rug, and then she looked up and she said, Perhaps we only have as much as we can love, Rachel." You know how often a life-threatening illness gives us new eyes, enables people to discover the art of living and to find a deeper satisfaction in their lives. You know, in the process of healing ourselves from being sick, our values can change, our priorities can shift, and values and priorities that have limited us for years can fall away, allowing us to live more deeply and fully and passionately than before. This is a story about another one of my patients that this happened to. Cindy's husband, when I first met them, described her to me as crazy clean, right? Like her mother before her, her house was perfectly organized. Every drawer was organized, every piece of metal shone. And this despite the fact that she lived with 3 small children and a big bear of a husband. She had an unerring eye for the slightest disorder. One of her young daughters told me that her mom could spot a Cheerio on the kitchen floor from the other room and would not be satisfied until the offender had picked it up and confessed. But cancer changed that. Her chemo made her so weak she couldn't get from her bed to the bathroom easily. She didn't have the strength to cook. And the entire neighborhood had invaded her perfectly organized kitchen and fed her family. Kind hearts and hands, unfamiliar with the household rules, had folded and washed and put away laundry in all the wrong places. Her perfect walls were covered with dozens of pictures made by the classmates of her kids, each one with a prayer for her recovery, each one stuck on the wall with a piece of Scotch tape. And during the worst of it, her husband had brought home a kitten who shed everywhere, but whose purring warmth had comforted her through the dark hours of the night when she was so sick from her chemo that she couldn't sleep. Now, a number of years later, she says with a laugh, she would never want to be the way she was before she had cancer. I drove my family crazy, she said. I resented them and all of my guests because they disturbed the order of things. I'd been that way for years. She told me of a visit to her sister soon after she finished chemotherapy. The sister is the daughter of the same mother. She says, we were sitting together in the kitchen drinking tea, and I happened to look into her living room. She had one of these rugs that shows every footprint, and it was vacuumed so perfectly that every hair of it was pointing in the same direction. She said, at one time, this would have given me a deep sense of satisfaction. Now, it just seemed lonely to her and untouched by life. And she began to laugh, and she said to me, there's so much more to life than a perfectly clean kitchen floor, Rachel. You know, life-threatening illness can shuffle our values exactly like a deck of cards. Sometimes a deck that's been on the bottom of our, a card's been on the bottom of our deck for years, turns out to be the top card. I mean, the thing that really matters. And you know, having watched people sort their cards and play their hands in the presence of death for many, many years, I would say that rarely is the top card perfection, or possessions, or pride, or even power. Most often, the top card is love. You know, the art of living is closely tied to our ability to recognize meaning in the lives that we are already leading. Meaning offers us satisfaction and fulfillment no matter what our lives are. And meaning has this power not by changing our lives, but by changing our experience of our lives. And there's a wonderful Sufi story about the power of meaning to change the experience of work. It asks us to imagine that we are in the 14th century watching a group of stone cutters build a cathedral. And we stand there, we watch these men. They're all doing the same thing. Someone brings them a rock. They very expertly cut the rock into a block. And then someone takes the block away and they bring them another rock. And they all cut that rock into a block. And someone takes that block away and another rock is brought. And we watch this for about 10 minutes. And then we go up to the first man. We say to him, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? And he turns on us with great hostility. And he says, idiots, use your eyes. I saw you watching us. You know, you see what I'm doing? They bring me a rock. I cut it into a block. They take it away. They bring me another rock. I cut it into a block. I've been doing this ever since I was old enough to work. And I'll be doing it to the day I die. Why are you asking such a stupid question? Use your eyes. And so we back away from this blast of hostility, and we go to the next man. We say to him, excuse me, sir, what are you doing? And he says, I'm earning a living here for my beloved family. With the money they pay us, there's good food on the table, and the house is a strong house, and the children are growing well. He says, I'm earning a living here for my beloved family. And then we go on to the last person, the last stonecutter, and we say to him, and what are you doing? And he turns a face towards us that is absolutely radiant, and he says, oh, I'm building a great cathedral, a holy lighthouse that will stand as a beacon for people who are lost and frightened and alone in the dark. And it's going to stand for 1,000 years. Now, obviously, Each one of these men is doing exactly the same work. But finding a sense of meaning in the most routine and ordinary of tasks opens those tasks to the experience of satisfaction and joy, and even a sense of gratitude for the opportunity to do this work. It's very surprising how often people are not aware of the meaning in their own lives. How easy it is to lose the larger significance of our work and of our lives. We become distracted by pragmatic concerns and time pressure and fatigue. We can become blinded by cynicism and numbness and perfectionism. But our lives and our work are full of meaning anyway. Every one of us lives a far more meaningful life than we know. Finding meaning is not about doing anything different. It's about seeing familiar things in new ways, in different ways. I'll tell you a doctor story about this. Harry is an ER doc. I think of them as the fighter pilots of medicine. And Harry lives on the edge of burnout. He runs one of the large emergency rooms in this city. He's also a very cynical man. And one evening, in the midst of his very busy emergency room, a woman was brought in about to deliver a baby. And as soon as he examined her lying there on the gurney in the hallway, he realized that unless her OB was actually in the building, he was going to get to deliver this baby himself. And he was pleased. As he told me, he enjoys the technological challenges of delivery. And so he kindly told her that the doctor was on the way and that he had delivered hundreds of babies there in the emergency room, and if the baby came before the doctor, he would be right there with her to deliver her. And he'd barely gotten these words out when the baby's head appeared, and the delivery began, and the ER team swung into action, and nurses stood on either side of Harry, supporting this woman's legs on their shoulders, and there, right in the corridor, Harry successfully delivered her of a little baby girl, and everything went perfectly. He had freed the aftercoming shoulder. There was no cord around the neck. The baby was breathing spontaneously. He had a sort of a familiar sense of pride, in himself and in his work. And with the baby still attached to her mom, he laid her, as we've been taught, along his forearm with the back of her little head in his palm, and he lowered her below the level of the placenta, and he began to suction her nose and mouth. And as he was doing this, suddenly the infant opened her eyes and looked deeply into his eyes. And in that instant, Harry stepped past his usual way of seeing things, and he realized a very simple thing. He was the first human being that this little girl had ever seen. And he could feel his heart go out to her in welcome from all people everywhere. And he was filled with this irrational sense of hope. But it didn't render him incompetent. He continued to suction the baby's nose and mouth and clamped and cut her cord. But this incident has changed his whole way of doing his work. As Harry said, he has delivered hundreds of babies, and he enjoys the excitement of making rapid decisions and testing his own competency. But he also told me he had never let himself experience the meaning of what he was doing before, or let himself know what he was serving with his expertise. Harry is not a particularly emotional man, but he describes the moment When the baby opened her eyes and looked deeply into his eyes, he described that moment as a holy moment. And he says in that flash, he felt years of cynicism and fatigue fall away from him, and he could remember why he had chosen this work in the first place, and he realized that everything he put into it had been worth it to him. Now, Harry says that he feels that this is the first baby he ever delivered. The first baby he ever really delivered. And he was aware that as this thing happened, he had this feeling, and being a guy, he couldn't identify what the feeling was right away. It took him a couple of days. It wasn't his usual sense of pride. It wasn't his usual sense of satisfaction. What it was a sense of gratitude for being the person who got to be there in that moment. And this event has made him wonder how many other moments of inspiration and connection to life he's missed in the 30 years that he's been a doctor. He thinks there have been many. So he looks for these holy moments on purpose now, and he finds them because they're everywhere, and they're in everybody's life. I thought I would just share with you a very simple technique for finding new eyes. A very simple thing. It's a little journal that we get all the medical students to do, and we also, in my continuing medical education courses, we get a lot of hardened, as we were, doctors to do it as well. And what it is that you have your little book, and you're going to spend 10 minutes a night at the end of the day. And what you do is you sit down with the book and you reflect on your day, going backwards. I just had dinner, then I was driving home. Before that, I had a meeting with Mrs. X. Whatever your life is, going backwards, like a videotape, until you get to the moment you got out of bed in the morning. And you're going to do this 3 times. The first time you ask yourself the question, what surprised me today? As soon as you find anything that's an answer to that question, anything at all, you write it down briefly in your little book, and then you start that review again from the back, from the moment you're sitting, going forward to the morning, and you ask yourself the second question, what touched my heart today? As soon as you find anything that answers that question, you write it down, and then you start the review again, and you ask yourself the third question, what inspired me today? As soon as you find anything that answers that question, you write it down, and you're done for the day. Now, the first person ever to do this was a cancer surgeon who was leaving medicine, and his wife gave him the gift of this course I teach, probably in the hopes to get him to change his mind. And I suggested he keep the journal. He didn't want to do this. I told him it was cheaper than Prozac. Right? So he decided, he said he would try. And 4 days into it, he called me up and he said, what's the trick, Rachel? I said, what do you mean trick? He said, well, I get the same answer all 3 days that I've been doing this. Nothing, nothing, and nothing. I mean, how can I be so busy and I'm leading such a boring life? And I said, are you looking at your life as if you're a doctor? He says, of course I am. And I said, no, you need to look as if you're a novelist or a journalist or even a poet. You need to look for the stories. And there was this silence, and he said, I'll try, right? Didn't hear from him again for a long time. And then he came by to thank me for the changes that had happened in his life. He says at first he could only see his own life 7 hours after it had happened. He would see things that were really surprising and touching and inspiring, but he'd only see them at night when they'd happen at 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock in the morning. But then the gap closed because seeing meaning is a capacity. We build it the same way we build a muscle. And he began to be inspired and touched and surprised in the moment his own life was happening to him. And then a lot of things started to change because without saying one word to anybody, people started talking to him differently. He was probably talking to them slightly differently. They began sharing much more with him. They began sending him pictures of the life he had returned to them through his cancer surgery. They began including him in celebrations at the end of chemotherapy. And he says, you know, I really feel a deep sense of what it is that I'm able to do, and I am so glad that I am able to do this work. So the journal is very powerful. It's very psychologically sophisticated. Most of us have a front row seat on life, and we are sitting in that front row seat with our eyes closed. So, another capacity that helps us with the art of living is to develop a sense of mystery. You know, our whole culture is based on the pursuit of mastery and control. The entire culture. We're so deeply into mastery that we don't even see mystery when it happens right in front of us, or we offer ourselves some explanation of it, which is so far-fetched that it's amazing that we accept it, and we can accept that explanation for years. And this is especially true in my profession, I must say. So I'll tell you a story about this that happened to me. Years ago, I was a young doctor at Sloan Kettering, the great cancer hospital in New York City. And in those days, there was no hospice. So people whose care couldn't be managed at home, they were admitted to the hospital to die. And there was one such man who was admitted to die. And I don't remember his name, it's too many years, but I sure remember his x-rays. His bones looked like Swiss cheese. They were riddled with cancer, and he had two big snowballs of cancer in both of his lungs. And in the 2 weeks he was with us in the hospital, every one of those lesions got smaller and disappeared, and they never came back. Now, were we in awe? Certainly not. We were frustrated. Obviously, someone misdiagnosed this man. So we sent his slides out again to pathologists all over the country, and the pathologists all wrote back and said, classic osteogenic sarcoma. So we had rounds. And rounds is a meeting of doctors, all the doctors in the hospital, and the word had gotten out. So doctors from other hospitals actually came to look at this man, to look at his slides, to hear his story. And I remember the conclusion that 350 physicians reached that morning. It was decided that the chemotherapy that had been stopped 11 months before had suddenly worked. And the embarrassing part of this is I never questioned this conclusion for the next 15 years. I accepted it absolutely, completely. You know, it's hard to realize, to think outside of the box, especially when everyone's thinking inside the box. But outside the box can be where life is. You know, and it's hard to realize that all of your hard-won knowledge about the nature of the world may only be provisional, and life may be different than you have believed it to be. This is stressful. It's even frightening. You know, if you read any of the Holy Scriptures, when an angel shows up in front of a human being, I mean, a mystery, right? The angel says the same thing. Remember what the angel says? Be not afraid. Right? Be not afraid. So it is stressful, but it's also rewarding. Because befriending the unknown can restore a sense of wonder and awe and aliveness to your life. a sense of gratitude for witnessing things that you could never explain. And we may all need to know a little less and wonder a little more, because people who wonder are rarely depressed or burned out. I used to think that living well was about having all the answers. I'm trained as a physician, after all, that the more answers you had, the better life you were able to have. I don't think that anymore. I think the art of living is less about having the right answers than about having the right questions. And sometimes the questions that help us to live have no final answers at all. And you can carry one of these questions with you all of your life, finding deeper and deeper answers as you grow in your capacity to engage with life. One of the cardiologists in one of my groups on mystery told us the story of his father's death. He had been 15, and his father was he had been 15. His brother was 17, and at that time, his father had had Alzheimer's for at least 10 years and hadn't spoken for all that time. So he's a kind of a walking vegetable. His mother had taken care of the father with great devotion. And as her boys got older, she'd sometimes take an afternoon off to go and do some shopping or meet a friend, and they would babysit their father. And the event happened on one of those Sunday afternoons. They're sitting in their living room, the two boys, the 15-year-old and the 17-year-old, and they're watching football. And Dad is sitting in a chair, absolutely immobile, looking off into space. And Mark told us that suddenly his father made a noise and clutched his chest and pitched forward onto the rug. He had collapsed. And both his sons ran to him. And Mark said he knew something was terribly wrong because his dad was gray and struggling to breathe and sweating. And his brother said to him, "Mark, call 911. But before he could get up off the rug, a voice that he could barely remember, a voice he hadn't heard in 10 years, said to him, "No, son, don't call 911. Tell your mother I love her. Tell your mother I will be all right." And then his father died. Right? Now, in the state that this happened, if someone dies suddenly like this, you by law had to have an autopsy. And at post, his father's brain was almost completely destroyed by this terrible disease. And so Mark was left with a question. Who spoke? He says nothing he has ever read in any medical text has brought him closer to the answer. But carrying the question with him has changed him. He says it gives meaning to his work, that the question, who spoke, is present in his relationship with every patient, his relationship with every human being, that at the heart of every human being is a mystery that cannot be penetrated but only appreciated. You know, there's a question that I carry with me the way Mark carries his question. I have worked with people with cancer for 25 years as their therapists, so I've listened to their stories. Often they're young people. Often their stories are very, very difficult. And you know, I have not been sustained in this work by my expertise. There's a question that has sustained me, which has no answer at all. And the question is, could there be an unknowable purpose to life? Could there be an unknowable purpose to suffering? And this is a question I will never have an answer to. But the question itself sustains me, and it enables me to do this work with an open heart. And so for me, over time, living well is not about having all the answers. It's about the opportunity to pursue unanswerable questions in good company. couple more thoughts. More than anything, I think that the art of living is about recognizing our power to make a difference. To know that we matter, whether we are sick or well or young or old. Most of us are not aware of our power to affect the lives of people around us. Often people think they need to be wealthy or educated or politically powerful to make a difference. But the reality is that there is a web of connection between us, and we can make a huge difference in the lives of people, just as we are. Most of us have made a huge difference in the lives of people, much more than we realize, and we can even affect the lives of strangers in powerful ways, people whose names we don't even know. One of my favorite stories about this was told to me by a colleague of mine. Her name is Elaine, and her field is domestic violence. And Elaine is a very small woman. She's about 5 feet tall, and she's as delicate as a porcelain cup. She teaches at the University of Utah, and her life has affected the lives of thousands of women through her workshops and her writings and her television show, all of this. Right? And I went as a visiting scholar to the University of Utah, so we were having dinner. And I looked at her across the table, and for the first time it occurred to me, how did she get in this field? She's such an unlikely person to be in such a violent field. So I asked her, and she said, "Oh, Rachel, I used to be one of these women." And she told me about her first husband, who had been a very violent and angry man. But he'd also been a pillar of the community. He'd been a professional. And in public, he had always treated her as a perfect gentleman. So no one suspected that her personal life was a living hell. People actually envied her marriage. And like most abusers, he had told her the abuse was her own fault because of the stupid things she said and the stupid things she did. And she'd keep trying, harder and harder. It was never good enough for him. And eventually, over time, she became so ground down that she came to believe that she deserved to be treated in this terrible way. Now, all this ended abruptly on a street corner in New York City. She and her husband were visiting. They're standing on the corner, waiting for the light to change. And she looks across the street, and she sees a really beautiful Art Deco building. And she turns to her husband. She says, "Honey, look at that beautiful building." And he, thinking they're alone, speaks to her in the tone of utter contempt that he reserved for their private conversation. He says to her something like, "You idiot. You mean the yellow building? Anyone with eyes in their head would know that it's just like every other building on the street. What are you talking about?" And her reaction was the same reaction she had always done when he was either physically or emotionally abusive to her. She just fell silent. But a woman standing next to him, a perfect stranger, also waiting for the light to change, turned to him in disbelief and said, "What? That's a perfectly beautiful building. She's absolutely right. And you, sir, are a horse's ass." And then the light changed. And this total stranger went across the street, went on with her life. But Elaine told me this was the epiphany. This was the moment that her whole life began. Because she understood in this flash that she had never deserved to be treated this way. She understood what had been happening to her in 7.5 years of being married to this man. And she felt something very unfamiliar come up in her. She described it as a kind of a strength or a kind of a dignity. And she knew that it was going to take time. It was going to take planning. but she was going to be able to find a way to live this man. Right? Now, this isn't even a story about Elaine. This is a story about the stranger. Because if we were to go to New York City tonight, find the woman, and say, excuse me, have you ever saved anyone's life? I don't think she'd say, yeah, of course, 20 years ago, standing on that street corner waiting for life. I don't think she'd say that at all. I think most likely she would say to us, what? Save lives? I don't save lives. Do I look like a doctor to you? We have all affected the lives of many more people than we know. There is a web of connection between us that can only be seen through the heart. So, let me say something interesting about the art of living here. I've really learned everything I know about it from my mother, but also from people at the end of life. The view from the end of life is so much clearer than the view that any of us has tonight, you know. Cancer, particularly, strips life down to its essentials. And it's surprising how simple things become and how few things matter and how much those few things really do matter. You know, in the 25 years that I have been a physician, a therapist to people with cancer, no one has ever said to me, if I die, I'll miss my Mercedes. And I practice in Marin County. Cancer seems to help people to understand that the Mercedes and the lifestyle that they may have been pursuing all their life is really the booby prize. And what matters is simpler and more accessible to every one of us. What matters is who we've touched on our way through life and who has touched us and what we leave behind us in the minds and hearts of other people. And I'd like to tell you one more story about a man who discovered something important at the 11th hour. At the age of 45, George had patented a part of a medical invention. Right? And for more than 20 years after this, he was the CEO of a small but very successful company that manufactured and distributed these parts worldwide. He was a fine businessman and a shrewd investor, very sophisticated fellow who collected many beautiful things and had traveled the whole world. And by most standards, most people would have said he led an enviable life. About 6 months before I met him in my office, he'd been diagnosed as having colon cancer, which was widespread at the time of his diagnosis. So his physicians told him that he didn't have very long. His diagnosis had shaken him badly. I had expected he'd be depressed about the seriousness of his situation. But this wasn't the case at all. There was a lot else on his mind. I've wasted my life, Rachel, he told me. I have 3 ex-wives and 5 children. I support them all, but I don't know any of them. I never took the time to know them, or to know anyone else either. I don't think there is anyone who is going to miss me, and I'm leaving nothing behind me but a great deal of money. And then he turned away, and I wasn't sure, but I thought his eyes had filled with tears. Now, the thing that George invented and that his company manufactures is part of this medical device which has enabled people whose chronic disease was previously unmanageable to live almost normally. And at that time, another of my patients used this device, and it changed her life. Before the device was available, she was housebound. Managing her symptoms took up all of her time. She'd been unable to work. She had no friends. She was unable to literally have a life among other people. But soon after she was fitted with the device, she got a job for the first time. And there she began to have friends, and eventually she met a lovely man and fell in love with him and married him, and she had a delicious little boy. What she told me when we first met was, the day they gave me this device, I was reborn, Rachel. And in a way, I think she was. Now, of course, it's a breach of privacy to tell one patient about another patient. But I thought that perhaps I could tell Stephanie that I knew the man that created her device, and maybe she could write an anonymous note, about her experience. And when she discovered, though, that I knew the man whose invention had made the device possible, she wanted to meet him. She asked if he was willing to come to her house for dinner so that she could show him what he had made possible for her. I said I'd ask him. George was really surprised that I knew someone who used his device. He had never met anybody. And he was very touched that she wanted to meet him. And so he offered to take her and her husband to dinner at one of San Francisco's most expensive and exclusive restaurants. I don't think so, I told him. And so an evening was found, and George went to dinner at Stephanie's house. Now, the week after this dinner, he sat in my office shaking his head in wonder. He'd expected to have dinner with this young couple. But when he arrived, George was welcomed by dozens and dozens of people. Stephanie's family, her friends, her neighbors, the whole community of people that had sustained her in the years that she was an invalid. They had decorated the little house with crepe paper, and everyone had brought food. It was an extraordinary meal and a wonderful celebration. But that wasn't the important part, Rachel, George had told me. They'd really come to tell him a story. They each had a different part of it to tell. It took them almost 2 hours to tell it. And it was, of course, the story of Stephanie's life. And George had cried most of the time. And at the very end, Stephanie had come to him and said, "This is really a story about you, George. We thought you needed to know." And I did need to know, Rachel, he told me. I had tears in my eyes. But I also had a question that began to come up for me. And when he finished speaking, I asked him, "George, how many of these things do you make every year?" "Close to 10,000, he told me. I only knew the numbers, Rachel. I had no idea what they meant. So in the end, we may measure our value and the value of our lives not by our knowledge, not by our possessions, but by our stories. In the end, our stories will bless us and enable us to know at last who we are, what our true value is, and to find peace with our lives." Thank you.